Welcome back to another episode of the House Husband Diaries. As always, I am your host, Carter C., and today we are talking subtle. I know it's not subtle. I'm just messing with you. It's subtle. Subtle hints in the thrill of the chase. So, what does a subtle hint look like? And that's what I'm going to talk about. Words like insinuate, words like bothers me, etc. So, we'll start right now. We'll get right into it. Page 133, right? I hope that noise didn't come in. If it did, somebody just called and I just hung up on them. So, that's how it works. Page 133. There are also other subtle clues sprinkled in the stories. Right there. Forrest's own words. There are also other subtle clues sprinkled in the story. So we know that there's subtle hints, or he says clues, but he's said since that there's subtle hints to the clues. So let's start with page 6, right? All right. So I'll tell you this too. I've got about 3 more weeks worth of themes, keywords, etc. And then we're going to start a secondary analysis. So by the end of April, we will be moving into a secondary analysis. And what I hope that means for me is that I will start to formulate a solve in my process. So all of these videos, I hope they help you. I hope they're interesting for you. But it's also me going through the thrill of the chase in a methodical, systematic way, working on a solve. And I've gotten a number of people, as people saying, hey, why don't you have a solve? You should have a solve, yada, yada, yada. Just pick a where warm water's hot. And that's just not how I roll. I'm not going to go on a 2,000-mile journey, quarantine or no quarantine, on a whim. And I want to be able to work through the common sense, the logical, and the imaginative, and come up with something that I'm confident in. And I just, most of the stuff that I come up with, I can pick holes in it without going boots on the ground. So why would I spend the money to go prove myself correct? I don't need to. I already know I'm correct, that it's not the right solve. So that's what we're doing here. So this is just sort of, hopefully we'll get through these videos in the next few days. They'll come out in the next few weeks, and then we'll start that secondary analysis, and we'll move towards having a complete solve by sometime. And who knows, maybe June, July, August, and maybe we'll get out to the Rockies later this year, once all the coronavirus quarantine is over. All right, let's do this. Page 6. We got some stuff to get through. Got to turn the hat on backwards and get serious. All right. Where are we? Page 6. And then my hair turned gray. Okay, white. But that problem was easily solved by just telling people I was dyeing it, and they never knew the difference. So here's why I put this in the subtle hints in this category theme video. On the, I think it's the 3rd page, right? Well, page 4 is the preface, and then you have Life is a Game of Poker on page 5. So it's kind of the 2nd page, right? So on the 2nd page of words, Forrest is already saying that he just told people one thing and they never knew the difference. Does that not strike you as odd, or as a potential that he could just say something in the thrill of the chase and we would all assume that it means home of brown or where warm water's hot, and that or later on in an interview he could say something and it's what we want to hear, and through our own imaginations or our own confirmation biases and stuff, that we would just take that to mean whatever we wanted it to, and that we would never know the difference. So what I think about that, I think it's subtle. But he says right there, I could tell you something and you never know the difference. It's a joke, but it's also could very well be true, because we're 10 years into a hunt, into finding this treasure chest, and nobody's been able to get within theoretically 200 feet. Why not? I think there's something there. All right, let's do this. Page 9. Talked about this a couple times, but I think it's interesting to note, and it comes up in different themes. Just as I was about to ask the little girl at the computer about those authors, she raised her coffee cup to take a sip. And I swear that cup all but covered her whole face. I thought maybe she was trying to hide. Anyway, when she finished sipping, she gave me a nice smile that made me feel better, and asked me to please follow her as she regaled me with the reasons why we are so lucky to have great books in our lives. So, she raised the coffee cup, covered her face, right? So what I'll say about this is twofold. A very similar story was shared by Forrest in, I think it's Dal Neitzel's Santa Fe interviews. The YouTube channel is The Thrill of the Chase. And he talks about, I think it's when he and Eric Sloan, I think it's I don't know if it's 9 or 12 minutes or something. I don't remember exactly. But he talks about, they got into it about pricing the art, and a waitress tried to get out the side door, and somebody else tried to hide behind a coffee cup. So I wonder if he's just messing with us. There's actually not anything there. Then I also wonder, what does this say about perspective? And how does that perspective lead us to view the poem, the clues, and the thrill of the chase? And I say all of that because on page 97 and 98, we go to My War for Me. And it says, then, and for no reason at all, I closed my fist, stuck my thumb out, and moved it close to my face, an inch away from my left eye. My God, I had completely covered up Philadelphia. I had covered up millions of people with my thumb. The thought occurred to me that I was getting hypoxic, so I removed my glove, grabbed my flashlight, and looked at my fingernails. The blinker was still looking at me, was still winging at me, blah, blah, blah. All right. Perspective. Left eye. End is ever drawing nigh. You know what I mean? I don't think we have to do that when we get to the treasure, but it's interesting. So he's at Borders, right? Page 9, going back. 9 through 11, he's at Borders. He goes back to Borders. Then he gets into line, and they're borderline biddies that he's behind in line. And then a couple of pages later, right? Well, more than a couple pages, no place for the biddies. So you've got this borderline biddies. People have talked about it. I don't really know that there's anything there, honestly. It's interesting, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was near some border. Is it subtle? Is it not so subtle? You be the judge, right? Page 12. I thought this was interesting. He says towards the bottom, I've never been able to find a place where I couldn't embarrass myself. And this store was now number 1 on the list. Embarrass myself? Or are you embarrassed? I mean, I think you'd be embarrassed by the riches when you open the chest. That's part of the wow factor. You're embarrassed that you found this multi-million-dollar, unbelievable treasure chest filled with gold, filled with precious artifacts. You're embarrassed. And this store, Borders, was now number 1 on the list. So is that a subtle hint that somehow a border, whether it's the border of New Mexico and Colorado, whether it's the border of Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming, Montana, yada, 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 I wouldn't be surprised if a border played into this whole find, this whole solve, the correct solve, and that you found yourself embarrassed at a border, and you're embarrassed because of the riches. It's fascinating to me. These are the subtle hints that I don't hear most people talking about, but they're subtle. And you could take them either way. You can read right through and say, that's just a silly, childish writing style. You could say, hey, maybe there's a subtle hint in there that leads to a clue in the poem. And we'll get there, right, in a couple weeks when we do the secondary analysis. So this is all primary analysis. We're just going through, looking at themes, keywords, all that kind of stuff. And then I'm going to go back through and I'm going to say, okay, here's when I pull out of all these videos, I've got all my notes. It's what I do, front and back of all these pages. Every single one of these videos I've got notes on. We're going to go through them all. I've got an Excel spreadsheet of all of this too. I write it down and I have an Excel spreadsheet of all of this stuff. And we're going to go through, we're going to search it all. We're going to find what comes up multiple times over and over in different themes. And we'll see. Maybe you've already done it, but I haven't. And I can't wait to see, because I haven't thought through this. There's no emotion involved in this. There's no confirmation bias. It's simply reading it, saying, okay, here are different words, here are different themes, and who knows what we're going to come up with. But I feel like I keep coming back to a bunch of the same pages over and over and over. All right. Enough of being embarrassed. Let's go to page 32. My Spanish toy factor. He says, if I could find a good-looking rock during the next hour, I could grind it against a small sandstone slab that I always carried in my pocket. If I could find. So this is what I think could potentially be subtle. It fits right in with the story to say, if I could find a good-looking rock during the next hour, I could grind it against a small sandstone slab that I always carried in my pocket. But what if that's a subtle hint saying, that good-looking rock over there is my blaze. That good-looking rock over there is heavy loads or something. If I could find it, if Forrest is trying to find it in TTOTC, is that something that we should also be trying to find? That's why I'm putting it out here. I haven't heard of this from anybody. I've never heard of this kind of stuff. If you have thought of this, if you've put it on, The Hint of Riches or some other site. I don't read those Reddit, so maybe you're, 10, 15, 20 steps ahead of me. But these are just things I see, and I'm trying to think subtle hints. Page 33. He says at the end, if I could find where she's buried, I'd slip out there some dark night and push a nickel under her grave marker and just leave it there. Somehow I sense she knows that and is smiling down on me. And I've talked about that with the cemeteries and buried. I've talked about it at night, midnight. I've talked about it with grave markers. I've talked about it with smiling. I mean, those last couple sentences of my Spanish Toy Factory just scream themes. But what if that's a distraction to the actual find that he says earlier in my Spanish Toy Factory, which is if I could find a good looking rock. So maybe we need to figure out what a good looking rock is. And he tells us what kind of rock that he makes the marbles out of. So maybe it's that certain kind of rock that we're looking for. If we've been wise and found the blaze. What's a good looking rock? Maybe I should figure out how many times in The Thrill of the Chase he says good looking. Maybe it's a rock carved in the shape or the face that resembles Peggy. Probably not. Probably not. All right, page 45. Moving on down the road here. He says, I absolutely loved that place. And along the rivers, I could find the best agate rocks for making marbles. I was thinking about all of those things and even more. So he says he just absolutely loved that place. And along the rivers, I could find the best rocks. So he goes back to 13 pages earlier. He could find those rocks along the rivers. There's that type of rock for making marbles. So he made marbles all summer to come back and sell? Maybe. He absolutely loved that place. It's Yellowstone. I know those of you that are in love with Yellowstone, he's in love with Yellowstone. Maybe it's Yellowstone, or maybe it's another. Where do we find that kind of rock? Is that a subtle hint? And then he says, at the bottom, if I could find that Chevy, I'd buy it back and keep it forever. If I could find. So what is really interesting about that is I've just said 3 out of the last 4 references. Page 32, if I could find a good looking rock. Page 32, if I could find where she's buried. Page 45, if I could find that Chevy. Is he trying to say, if I could find these certain things, that would help you? If we could find those things for him, that's the trail. That helps us with the clues in the poem. What do your subtle hints look like? What's subtle? Page 59. He was quick to take the hint and said he would just ride along and help me keep the mountains company. Donnie Joe was quick to take the hint. Does Donnie Joe know something that we don't know? Is there a hint with Donnie Joe in looking for Lewis and Clark? He says the word hint. Is it subtle? Not so subtle? Do you wonder these things? I do. Page 94. Somehow these videos always tend to run longer than I think they're going to run. We got about 6 more quotes, so we'll move on through. Page 94. How innocent and foolish all of that seemed at the time, and even more so that a strangely insidious something began to gnaw at me. Now, insidious means something like subtle, but it's more of a negative term. So I don't know. At one point, I kind of thought that insidious meant something because he only mentions it in My War for Me and later in the book. And then he just starts to talk about insidious. And it stuck out to me. But the more that I go through these themes and the more that I just kind of am systematic and trying to think through this, I don't really think anything's here, but I just thought I would point it out. Maybe it helps you in some way. That a strangely insidious something began to gnaw on me. Next page, 95. And he says, let's see here. I got to refine this again. Down at the bottom, he says, for the next month, while I was on leave, the flourish of activities related to homecoming and reuniting with family and friends put my jungle thoughts on hold, except for occasional flashes that insinuated something unfinished. So there's an insinuation that something's unfinished. And then he says, I didn't know enough about what had happened to even speak of, much less understand what I was feeling and what it could possibly mean, if anything. It took weeks to digest as thoughts slowly started to seep back. What was this all about? Was it nothing? And then he goes on. He talks about his flight, and then I've read that in a previous, video. And I think there's something there. What that something is, we all wonder. All right, page 101. Let's get this video done. 101. He says, bottom of page 100 into 101, top of 101. His words are some of those that tell the insidious stories the best, stories that have made me think. We need to learn where warm water's hot. We need to think. These are the stories. And then he goes into that prose or that poem about the moving finger writes and having writ moves on. And it's just, the door of darkness and death. And nobody can come back from death to tell us about that road of where we have to go to know. It's fascinating. It's thinking. It's deep. It's real deep. It's deep. It's water high. Something like that. I'm telling you, don't sleep on the Finster. We're going to figure it out. 2020 is a year. Keep saying it. We're going to figure it out. Page 113. 3 more. We're going to wrap this up. I love this. She looked stunned, and her expression insinuated that I should have given her a longer answer. I think I said this in another video. She looked stunned. This is the teacher with the PhD in art history. Do you think this is a subtle hint or just a kind of a jab at everyone that maybe we're that female PhD teacher? That when we find out the answer, when Forrest, through the finder of the treasure, tells us, here's the winning solve, right? We're going to look stunned. And our expression is going to insinuate to Forrest and the finder that Forrest should have given us a longer answer. That the actual field, the search area, should have been bigger because of the grandiose words of the poem, that it's actually here. It's such a small place, the search area, and it's such a small, whatever. And we're going to be stunned. I think so. I think that is a blatant, subtle hint to something. I don't know yet, but it sticks out to me like a sore thumb, like a thumb. All right, page 116 and then 147. So page 116. And this is interesting to me, so I want your thoughts on this one. Down at the bottom. It looked cold and foreboding as I circled, trying to decide what Olga really had wanted. She said, on top of Taos Mountain. That desire seemed unlikely under the circumstances and somewhat aloof from any sober voice of reason. And then there's a famous line, the bitterness of cold remains long after the sweetness of a sentimental moment is forgotten. Surely her father was not way up on top. Okay. Riddle me this. Explain to me. Forrest is in an airplane with Olga's ashes. She said on top of Taos Mountain. He's in an airplane. He can get on top of anywhere in the world right now. Right? There is nothing above sea level that he cannot reach in an airplane. In his airplane. Why would he say her desire of being on top of Taos Mountain seemed unlikely under the circumstances? It seems very likely to me under the circumstances that you could fly your plane directly over Taos Mountain and drop ashes out of the window. Not only because you're a pilot, not only because you're in an airplane, not only because you have her ashes with you, but because you're also an experienced fighter pilot who has dropped bombs out of a fighter jet. So if any pilot is good at dropping ish out of windows or shooting stuff out of a plane and hitting a target, it would be a fighter jet pilot, I would assume. So that desire seems pretty likely under the circumstances. If you got me in a plane and you said, fly this over that mountain, well, good luck with me even actually making it to the mountain. But once I did get over the mountain, could I figure out the controls and then dump ashes over the top of the mountain? No, I mean, that would be a much more, I would say it seemed unlikely. Like, that's pretty unlikely. But with Forrest, it seems very likely. And somewhat aloof from any sober voice of reason. Why would it be aloof from any sober voice of reason? I'm stumped on that one. It doesn't make sense to me. That stands out to me as very subtle, but when I focus on it, very not subtle. It just smacks me in the face. It could be nothing. Could be subtly nothing. All right, last one. We'll end this video up. I'm pontificating and it's getting long. All right, last page of the book, page 147. He says, somewhere on page 147. And some of the things I've enjoyed the most. Right? I know. I'm trying to find it. This is what happens when you get to the end, right? Yeah. Here we go. Middle of the page. The aspirations of youth grow weak. Right? I've done it weak and now I'm tired. The aspirations of youth grow weak where they languish on the shelves of patience. And some of the things I've enjoyed the most in my life have come from the smallest voices. Now, everybody quotes the next sentence. That a butterfly is really a flutterby is one example. I don't think that's anything. It's an example. But I wonder if the real hint is right before that. And some of the things I've enjoyed the most in my life have come from the smallest voices. If you're talking subtle hints to the clues, what would be some of the smallest voices, whether they're in the poem or in the thrill of the chase. So I'll end this video here. It's a little bit longer than I thought it was. As always, I thank you so much for watching another episode of the House Husband Diaries. I love doing these videos. I love interacting with you. And let me know in the comments. You can always send me an email, carter@hhdiaries.com. And you can subscribe. You can do whatever you want. But thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you on the next episode of the House Husband Diaries. Have a great day.